Hello, everybody. I'm Darla Hasselbrook. I'm the Donor Engagement Manager for Friends of Iowa PBS. And tonight we're really thrilled to have Zach Sharpe with us. He is from the Iowa Storm Chasing Network, and he's here to answer some of our questions, to have maybe a little bit discussion about what we just saw. It was a fascinating film, didn't you think, Zach?
No, anything that's weather related, I absolutely love.
Now, I think probably myself and a lot of people who are watching are probably wondering how you got into this area. It's not something that everybody would want to do.
Yeah, so actually, funny story. Back in 2007, I lived through EF2 tornado. So it moved through my hometown of Norwalk, and living in, or like actually seeking shelter in the basement and experiencing the forces of Mother Nature has to throw out an EF2 tornado. The pressure sounded like the house was going to go, and at that time, it was sort of like the Dr. Fujita. It was basically, I want to study why tornadoes form and how do we prevent catastrophic injuries and fatalities from happening. So went off to Iowa State University to study meteorology, and have been storm chasing ever since. So I've been storm chasing for about 9 years now, and while in college, started this storm chasing group called Iowa Storm Chasing Network with Ben McMillan. And our team now consists of 14 different people, and we have team members all across the state of Iowa tracking these storms, broadcasting them live through social media or to the TV stations to give people advance warnings. But I always say that when you live through an event like that, like a tornado, it either causes you to become very fearful of them or absolutely in love with them. And I absolutely fell in love with the tornado.
But now this is not your full-time job. Are the 14 other people you work with, is that their full-time job?
No, so unfortunately, so obviously weather doesn't happen every day. I would love to be full time on the road storm chasing a tornado, but obviously Mother Nature doesn't produce tornadoes every day. So we all have real full time jobs. So we do this as a side hobby and go out there and give that advance warning, so that way people are able to protect their life and property.
Wonderful. Well, you have a job that I don't want. I'm very happy to see them from a distance. One of my most scariest memories is I was in a car actually on I-35 heading north. Going to go visit some relatives, and there I looked over and there was a tornado on my left. And the tornado was in the distance, but I could see it. And boy, I didn't want to stop. I just kept going north, hoping I would run away from it, and I did. But I know that's not probably what I should have done, but whoo, they scare me just now thinking about it. But we've had some questions that have come in from people who have been watching. One of them said that you talked about warm fronts and that they produce the best tornadoes. What about dry lines?
Yeah, dry lines produce really nice tornadoes as well. However, dry lines are typically a little bit more finicky than warm fronts. Dry lines are typically boom or bust, and sometimes you don't get the right dynamics to produce those photogenic tornadoes. However, if storms do form on the dry line, you get some very nice photogenic tornadoes. But usually, typically, the warm front has all the dynamics that you typically need, especially here in Iowa, to produce those tornadoes. And however, usually warm fronts produce high precipitation, or as what we call HP storms, and unfortunately usually shroud the tornado in rain, so you cannot see it. It's wrapped in rain. However, sometimes, like we saw this past Wednesday here in the state, we get some very photogenic tornadoes.
And another viewer is curious about where we learned where the F comes from with the F scale, but they're curious about where the E of the EF scale comes from.
Yeah, so back in 2007, they enhanced it. So then the E stands for enhanced Fujita scale. So anything prior to 2007, tornadoes were rated as an F. So the Parkersburg tornado was an F5. Anything after, so obviously 2007, when I lived through that tornado, that was an EF2. So basically, they were able to determine that so Dr. Fujita's tornado ranking of an F5 had 261 to 318 miles per hour. They found out that you really don't need 261 miles an hour to do F5 damage. You only need over 200 miles an hour damage. So they went back and enhanced that to have better assessment based on the damage that tornadoes actually cause.
And how many tornadoes have you seen in the past years that you've been doing this? Can you tell us?
Yeah, I'm probably close to a dozen now. We storm chase all across the United States. I've seen tornadoes in Nebraska, Iowa, South Dakota, and Illinois. So those are the states I've seen tornadoes in. Was pretty close to seeing one in eastern Colorado and Kansas, but I have not chased down to the deep south of like far Oklahoma or Texas. So haven't made it that far. Obviously, there's a lot of driving while storm chasing, and I am not one to enjoy long car rides. So I like to stay pretty close to home here. But obviously, your best tornadoes are further down in the deep south in Texas and Oklahoma. But once in a blue moon, we get a nice tornado here in the state of Iowa. So that's the days I wait for.
Yeah, I think that most people's definition would not be a nice tornado. You're probably one of the few that put nice and tornado together. But are there specific clouds that form prior to a tornadic outbreak? What should we be watching for?
Yeah, so we always look for cumulus clouds to develop, which are those we call Toy Story clouds. So if you ever watched the movie Toy Story in Andy's room, there's these really nice puffy white clouds. We start to look for those to begin to develop. And eventually those form into towering cumulonimbus clouds. And then those are the really tall, puffy clouds. And eventually that's the beginning life cycle of a thunderstorm. And eventually after that, we start to see more of that well-defined base. Sometimes you start to see a wall cloud. So if you start to see that wall cloud develop, which is that lowering below the actual storm, that's when you need to start be watching that very closely as a funnel could develop. And that's when you start to get a little miniature tornado, if you want to call it that, developing underneath that wall cloud. It hasn't touched the ground, and the tornado is not called a tornado until that funnel actually makes contact with the ground. So a lot of people see that funnel, they call it in as a tornado, but it's not officially a tornado until it's actually made contact with the ground. So if it stays up in the sky, there's a lot of times around here in the state that we just get some funnel clouds, and those are just referred to as funnel clouds and documented as that. But once they make a little swirl, even if it's a quick little 2-second swirl, that's then at that point defined as a tornado. But once you start to see that wall cloud develop, that's when you need to really be watching that storm closely.
And do you have a cool storm chasing car that you travel around with?
Yeah, so way back in the day, there was the Discovery Channel storm chasing show that had those armored tanks. We used to have one way back in the day, but they're a lot more pain to chase with than just normal vehicles. So our vehicles are not modified. They're just your typical, Ford Explorers that are decaled with pretty graphics for advertising purposes. But, obviously we take any vehicle that can get us to and from the storm very safely. So nothing special. You don't need a special vehicle to be a storm chaser. Some people, put some modifications to the windows, but those are typically the ones that try to intercept the hail core and get the baseball-sized hail hitting their vehicles because they're the more extreme documenting type, storm chasers. But I think to enjoy the storm, you need to be a couple miles away from it so you can take in the whole structure of it. Because to me, that's what's amazing about the storm is the structure around it, not getting pelted by debris or whatnot. So it depends. Whatever floats your boat, there's different types of storm chasers out there.
There's probably plenty of space around a tornado for everybody.
Oh yeah. Well, it's quickly. That's, I guess, a good point. You mentioned that as these storm chasing shows come out, it's a lot of people are starting to want to hop in their vehicle, and you really need to know how to properly storm chase. And because
that's true,
it's a very dangerous hobby, and if you don't know what you're doing, it can have catastrophic results. So obviously you want to make sure you know what you do before you hop in a vehicle and think you can go chase after a tornado. So, but yeah, the road space is becoming very, filled with cars nowadays, just simply because everyone around these storms wanted to, as you mentioned, earlier before we hopped on here, as storms form tornado warnings, people are like, hey, cool. Instead of seeking shelter in my basement, I'm going to hop in my car and go see if I can find it. So, unfortunately with social media and Facebook and TikTok and all that, that's the downside of today. We're more about, hey, can we get cool tornado video and post it to TikTok than if we can protect our life and property. So,
yeah, we were talking about the fact that now with a warning, and now our mapping of tornadoes is obviously so much better than it was not so many years ago, that I don't know that I personally maybe don't feel that urgency as much maybe as I would have before, because I see that it's a warning. So I think, oh, I have time to get to where I need to get to. And maybe I don't have all that time. How do you kind of balance that of when you should really seek shelter or seek more protected shelter?
Obviously, as soon as that tornado warning is issued, you should be going straight to that basement, even if that storm is 20 minutes away, because that's still 20 minutes you can get into your shelter, make sure you're prepared. But there's been multiple discussions around this in the scientific communities. How long is too much time? If we give you an hour ahead of the storm to say, hey, you got 1 hour before that tornado hits your community. Is that too much time? It's like, what do you do with that hour? Do you grab your prized possessions, get in your vehicle, and go visit a family member that's 2 miles away or like further away? Or do you take that hour and clean the house, and eventually it's like, oh, I got 15 seconds left before a tornado hits, now I'll go to the basement? So it's like, how much time is too much time? Obviously, the warning time has significantly increased as technology continues to improve. We're up to 14 minutes now is the average lead time before a tornado hits. But I did see a question in the chat between believing that there should be something between a watch and a warning, and I would have to disagree with that. A watch basically means the atmospheric conditions are present for a storm to develop, whether it's a severe storm or a tornado. And then a warning basically means that storm has now had the dynamics to produce a tornado or is producing something. And there's really no in-between stage. If it produces a warning, that storm's either going to do something or is already doing something, and you need to be seeking shelter and protecting your values and all that. So I disagree that there should be something in between, because I think that gets too complicated. There's too many, obviously over the last couple of years, the Weather Service has refined even winter storm warnings, reducing, different products and trying to consolidate it to make it less confusing than what it is today. So I think if you threw something else in there, I think it would make it too cloudy. And then there's, talking about the Storm Prediction Center, they issue the enhanced risk or the marginal risk or the moderate risk. There's just questions like, what's the difference between an enhanced and slight risk? It's so there's a lot of, refinery that needs to continue to happen to help convey that message properly.
One of our viewers says, lately I've heard our meteorologists say conditions are good for funnel clouds, but there's no tornado watch and no tornadoes are expected. How can they be confident in that? If the conditions are right for funnel clouds, what condition definitely means or will give us the development of a tornado?
So it comes back down to the dynamics in the atmosphere. When they say funnel clouds are present, like possible but not tornadoes, they rarely touch down. That means you have a couple of the dynamics that produce tornadoes, but you don't have all of them to produce tornadoes, and you're missing the larger ones that produce tornadoes. So it's sort of like if you take an analogy of your car, right? It's like my car will drive as long as it has gas. It's like if you don't fill it with gas, you can still push it down the road when you put it in neutral, but if you don't have gas in it, you're not going to go anywhere or very far with it. So it's the same, it's the same analogy. If you don't have all the major dynamics needed there to produce a tornado, you might get a funnel cloud, and it could possibly, if it taps into the right things, that you might get a very brief, weak tornado. However, they're very rare and uncommon, so that's the major difference there between funnel clouds are possible, but not tornadoes.
And with the enhanced scale, is there now an EF6?
No, so it only goes up to the EF5. So you have anywhere between EF0 to EF5. And the one thing a lot of people don't know about is there's an EF unknown. And then the EF unknown is basically that, hey, we got confirmation that there was a tornado, but it didn't hit anything, so we don't know how to rate it. So that it gets a classification of EF unknown.
And is it true, if a tornado looks like it's not moving much your way, it may be in fact closer to you and moving your way?
Yeah, so the rule of thumb is if you're watching a tornado and it's growing in size and not moving, it's typically coming towards you and you're in the wrong position. If you see it not growing and it's moving from right to left, you're usually in a good, safe position. But if you're staring at it and it's growing in size and looks like it's getting larger and larger, it's probably because it's approaching your house or wherever you're at, and you need to be in your basement seeking shelter.
Well, then I was good in my car, because it was definitely, going north just like I was. So I made the right move there. So somebody said, well, then can you explain the Joplin, Missouri incident? I'm not exactly sure what that means.
Yeah, I guess I'm confused on if there's more context to the Joplin, Missouri tornado question there. Joplin tornado was a very large, powerful tornado that obviously wiped the town off, which was that F5 rating.
Well, maybe they'll give us a little more information.
Okay.
And now somebody said it's very interesting because you're a storm chaser, and that's different than storm spotters associated with the National Weather Service. Can you explain the difference?
So there's really no difference between storm spotters and storm chasers. Storm spotters are typically they stay local. They don't go out and they don't go to Missouri. They don't go to Minnesota. They don't travel far. They stay within their local area. They got their spotter number. And what folks don't understand, it's like, yes, it's nice to have that spotter number. The Weather Service appreciates that. However, you don't even have to have your spotter number. If you see a tornado, you call either your local dispatch, emergency dispatch, or if you call the Skywarn number, which is the National Weather Service. If you call those in and say, hey, my name is Joe, I live in Norwalk and I see a tornado, they're going to ask you a couple more details to document it, but they're not going to ask you what's your spotter number. It just, having that spotter number, it helps the Weather Service validate that they've gone through a spotter course. They know the difference between a funnel and a tornado, or a wall cloud and scud. They know the difference between the different things, and they are able to better report the weather that's going on out there than someone who hasn't taken the spotter class. But it's not, having that spotter number compared to storm chasers, there's no difference. We're obviously still doing the same thing. We're reporting what's going in underneath those clouds, because the radar beam can only do so much, and the radar can only show you that. So obviously the ground truth is still needed today.
Now, from watching the film, it seems that the area in the Midwest that tornadoes happen is pretty large, but it hasn't moved at all within the past years.
There's new research that's showing that the new tornado alley, as we used to know back in the 90s, which was classified anywhere from Texas up through Kansas and far southern Iowa, that has actually sort of shifted off to the east and south. So we're starting to see more of the southeast included in the new tornado alley, and we're starting to see actually Iowa's tornado season sort of be delayed. Typically Iowa's tornado season is late May to early June. But in most recent years, we're starting to see more of our tornadoes occur in middle June through July. So we're starting to see that push back. Obviously, we see tornadoes in April and sometimes early March, depending on if you get the right dynamics moving through as the seasons change from winter to spring. But most of as we saw, we had 26 tornadoes happen last Wednesday, which is now preliminary, the top 3 tornado outbreak in the state of Iowa. So obviously July is becoming more of an active month. What was it? 3 years ago, we had that tornado outbreak that hit Marshalltown and Pella. And that day we had 21 tornadoes, so we've seen quite a bit of tornado outbreaks occur in the month of July compared to what typically used to be late May and early June.
Some more information about the Joplin, Missouri question.
Okay.
They said you were talking about lower risk conditions, not producing very strong tornadoes, but Joplin, there were obvious conditions just prior, nothing, and then went to F5 fast. So I think they're wondering about that.
I'm assuming it's going back to the question of should there be a difference between a watch and a warning?
Maybe, yes.
So but obviously that goes into, the whole watch criteria. Typically the watches are issued several hours before storms develop. And yes, you could have a storm blow up from a little dot to an F5 tornado within a matter of 30 minutes. But that's part of the whole tornado watch or severe thunderstorm watch, is these storms could rapidly develop. And, it's like, you just have to be on guard, So I think that's also another disconnect there. I think a lot of general public, they see the tornado watch get issued and like, oh, okay, you know what, we might get a tornado today. We probably won't, but we might, but that's a disconnect. If you're in that tornado watch, you probably need to be watching the radar all day, because you could literally have a storm blow up in a matter of 20 minutes that produces an F5 tornado. And we saw that sort of with the Lake City tornado last Wednesday. The storm just west of Lake City blew up, and within a matter of half hour, it produced an EF3 tornado. So it's just, once again, if a watch is issued, you need to take it very seriously. No different than a warning. If a warning gets issued, you need to take that seriously. And I think that's where the disconnect is, that the general public is so used to false warnings or false watches that it's like, you know what, I'm not going to take it seriously because, last time we never got anything, but it's like, the minute I don't blame them, you can only cry wolf too many times, but if you don't take it seriously, there's going to be major consequences.
And I would suppose, even with the best of everything, there are going to be times where maybe they thought it wasn't going to be bad as it is. I would imagine even now with all of our technology, we still don't have a handle on this thing, probably.
Well, yeah, it's like data in science is only as accurate as technology. And obviously we've come a far way since 1970. It's like I sort of laughed at watching. It's like it's amazing how far technology has come, and I'm so thankful that technology has, because we've gone from a couple minute lead time for tornado warnings to 14 minutes. But once again, it goes back to, you just need to be on guard, and it obviously, if you don't take things seriously, the minute you don't, there's going to be major consequences. But we've seen that from time to time. For example, last Wednesday, originally the models had indicated that a couple isolated supercells would develop, maybe produce some tornadoes quickly, and then eventually line out into a squall line and produce some damaging wind gust. But what actually happened last Wednesday is supercells stayed maintained for about 5 to 6 hours and produced several tornadoes, a couple dozen tornadoes actually. And so it's like, once again, models can only be so right based on the data that gets fed into them. And going back to what data gets fed into them, the weather balloon launches get fed into them.
Yeah. Now, it's interesting because years ago, the southwest corner of the basement was supposed to be the best corner to go to. You don't hear specifics like that anymore. Has that changed now due to new research?
Yeah, so new research has really found that there's really no like safe corner of the house. Obviously you're going to have a tornado if it comes, from the southwest or the northeast. Typically the tornado is going to come from the west. But they found after inspecting all this damage that occurs after the tornado, there's really no safe corner to the basement. Obviously your basement is the safest spot. But if you really want the best safe corner, install a storm shelter. They make these, basically bullet resistant storm shelters that you can install within your basement, or if you don't have a basement, within your garage, they can fit into a corner of a garage. So it's like they're tested by the Texas Institute and they test them and they're rated for up to an F5 tornado. So it's like, if you really want the safest protection, install a storm shelter. They're a little costly, but it's like, if you had to put a value on your head, it's like, what's that value? And it's like, is it worth the money? It probably is.
Yeah. So what is your take on the derechos? And do you think they'll increase in frequency in Iowa?
So it's actually funny because a lot of people acted like derechos didn't exist until after last year. A lot of people were not accustomed to them. They didn't realize derecho was actually a new terminology. They thought it was like the polar vortex. They thought, it's like the media hypes it up and they have to slap some terminology on it. And they thought polar vortex was a new terminology they came up with. They thought derecho was a new terminology they came up with. And it's like, no, these terminologies have existed for a long time. It's just finally when the media gets to use them in a fancy headline that, derecho terrifies Iowa, it's like all of a sudden it's like, oh, hey, look, the media came up with a new tagline, but as for frequency, we typically get one. I would have to pull the actual stats, but I thought it was like we get one every like 2 or 3 years, so they're pretty common here in the state of Iowa. Typically they happen more on the eastern side, or they're more of the northeast corner. So from north central Iowa to east central Iowa, you see more of the derechos happen from that direction. But they're a little bit more common. But as for frequency and intensity wise, it's possible. We've seen, the weather, more frequent tornadoes in today's world, but actually from that aspect, tornadoes intensities had actually decreased ever since 2011. But we hear more of them nowadays because of smartphones. So obviously everyone has a smartphone and they're able to film it and throw it on TikTok and all that, like I talked about. But the amount of tornadoes have actually decreased since 2011. So but for intensity of derechos, going back to the original question, I don't think we'll see a significant increase. I think as technology improves, I just think we'll hear more about them just because it's easier to get word out about them.
You mentioned something, and it was talked about a little bit during the film with the weather balloons. That was new information to me. I didn't realize that every day,
yep,
all across the country, weather balloons are going up. And maybe you can talk a little bit about that. And then I'm curious, even on a day when everything seems fine, do they still send them up?
Yep. So you send them up twice a day. Like I said, the only ones in the state of Iowa are the weather service offices in the Quad Cities, so over by Davenport, and in the weather office in Omaha. That covers like the Iowa region. And they send them up once in the morning and once in the evening. And then those get fed into the algorithm for the weather models. And obviously it does all its calculations, and that helps get us the weather models that we use to predict the weather. However, on severe weather days, they can launch a couple additional ones. Usually it's mid-afternoon to see how the atmosphere has changed. And typically it's, once again, it's the local weather service. So on Wednesday, when we saw all the storms moving through central Iowa, the Omaha Weather Service launched a mid-afternoon one to see how the atmosphere had changed. I think maybe Davenport had launched one also as well. I don't remember, but I remember seeing Omaha had launched one. But usually on the bigger days, and it's usually when there's like bigger storms. So if there's a tornado outbreak in Kansas or something, the local weather service that launches the balloon in Kansas will launch a midday one to see how the atmosphere has changed. Or for like hurricanes, they launch them a little bit more frequently to see how the atmosphere has changed to help predict the path of the hurricane, to obviously give the people the latest update on the track of that.
Do you have a weather app that you can recommend to folks?
So we have our own weather app. It's called the ISCN weather app. We just launched it this year. Actually, it sends out push notifications. So it sends those out for the tornado watches and warnings, and you can customize it. So obviously I'm going to recommend our own weather app. It has interactive radar and all that. But if you're a professional from an aspect of like you want to track storms and want some really high res radar, similar to what the folks at the Weather Service use, there's a paid radar app called Radar Scope. It's $9.99. It's the best $10 you'll spend if you're a weather enthusiast and love like high res radar and look at correlation coefficient, basically all the technical jargon that we look at for looking for tornadoes and all that. It's the best radar out there, similar to some of the products that we use on the desktop.
And again, so the app for you it's ISCN.
Yep. So the initials for the Iowa Storm Chasing Network. So ISCN weather. And then that's free on the Android and Apple store.
Okay, great. Well, I think we maybe just have time for one more question or comment. Do you have a TikTok or a Facebook page? How else can we follow you to stay up to date on storms here in Iowa?
Yeah, so we have a Facebook page. It's the Iowa Storm Chasing Network. We're also on Twitter at IA Storm Chasing, and then on Instagram at Iowa Chase. We're not on TikTok yet. We're looking at getting into that because obviously that's where a lot of people are moving to as the world continues to evolve with social media. We're also on YouTube at the Iowa Storm Chasing Network, and we post a lot of great video content. And we broadcast live on Facebook and YouTube our storm chases there. And our website. We're also on the website at iowaweather.com.
Oh, Iowa Weather. Well, thank you so much, Zach, for joining us for this fascinating discussion. Certainly, I think we are all glad to have July ending, and we hope that what you're saying is true and we won't see any in August. We appreciate you staying with us, answering these questions. We will be posting this discussion part of our program in some highlights that we send out every week. So if somebody is looking for that information, if they had to leave early, or if they know somebody who'd be interested in this discussion, certainly you can give us a call and we're happy to make sure you get that email. But thanks again, Zach. We appreciate it. And thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you spending your time with us. We try to have one of these events every month. Our next one will be coming up in September. And we'll make sure that we let you all know that through our website at iowapbs.org. Thanks so much. Have a good evening.